Many people believe that over-unity in the field of electrical engineering is simply not possible. They are right, because it's not that simple. Certainly not as simple as a flashlight circuit. The square root of -1 is the source from where free energy arises. In other words, the non-thermodynamic over-unity, more apparent power exiting a circuit by comparison to the apparent power entering into it. And the square root of -1 is also the sink for the disappearance of reactive power, namely under-unity, less apparent power exiting a circuit by comparison to more apparent power entering into it. This results in the non-accountability of all energy transfers and conversions, which steps outside of the domain of thermodynamics as we know it today. Now, since reactive power can readily be converted into real power by three different methods that I know of, in a roundabout fashion, free energy is real and not a fiction. As a consequence, these three methods are resistance, full rectification bridge of 4 diodes converting AC to DC, and bifilar counterwound coil. When oscillating current cannot become saturated, it no longer exhibits a sine wave. Instead, it exhibits triangular waves brought about in my circuits by the separation of the phase of current from the phase of voltage by 1/2 cycle of oscillation, namely 180 degrees of angular separation. This is the passive sign convention's definition of the generation of power, but it is not occurring inside of a generator. Instead, it is occurring inside a circuit powered by a feeble voltage input, no different than the quantity of voltage available in our environment, which is about 1 part per millionth of a volt. Conventional wisdom conveys the ideology that the electrical reactance of a circuit offers impedance against the input voltage. But the opposite perspective is also true, in which the input voltage offers impedance to the electrical reactance of the circuit, because the circuit would like to create its own energy in the form of reactive power, but cannot if the input voltage fights it with sufficient strength. This is the way we normally do things. We fight it. It is necessary to keep this input voltage extremely low so as to prevent the throughput of voltage. Voltage throughput would cause current to maintain the same polarity as voltage outside of the source of input. But when voltage throughput is broken, impedance overwhelms voltage input, which can have two different results, either a comatose circuit by conventional standards, or else an over-unity circuit, depending on how it is constructed. An over-unity circuit must take advantage of capacitance and inductance to create a condition of the non-saturation of current in order to maintain the growth of reactive power so that this growth can accumulate to a reasonable amount necessary to power our devices. Since reactive power is lossless, in other words, it does not interact with thermodynamic conversions or losses, it can only accumulate until converted into real power by one method or another. I think a major contributing factor to our misunderstanding of free energy is our misunderstanding of the movement of energy across a conductor, such as down the length of a transmission cable or through the length of a coil. Electrical energy changes state within the valence shells, the valence electron shells. These are the shells, the outer shells of electrons that are not saturated. A shell normally has a certain maximum quantity of electrons per shell, and the valence shells do not have the full quota, and so they're not saturated. So electrical energy changes state within the valence shells of an electron, but does not exit the atom nor enter into it. This is an illusion brought on, this exiting or entering of energy, or the traveling of energy, is an illusion brought on by our pattern-oriented brain, which sees a ripple and thinks it is the movement of something substantial, when all it is the movement of a pattern that our brain recognizes. And that pattern is the ridge or peak of energy that is moving, not the energy itself. In order for energy to move, the matter which hosts that energy would have to move as well. But such is not the case within a conductive medium, such as a strand of copper wire. It is more likely to occur within a thundercloud of ionized particles. all the atoms of copper stay in one place along with the electrons within their valence shells. So the electrons don't move, they don't send out photons, they simply change their state within each atom, and they stay within the atom, but they change their state. And if you get a row of copper atoms, let's say in a copper wire, and the valence electrons change in a sequential manner, creating a pattern of change down the length of that wire, from a distance, we might think that something is traveling down the wire, but that's fuzzy perspective on our part. That's fuzzy logic. If we get up real close, we see that there's nothing moving down the length of the wire. Instead, what we see is individual copper atoms, their valence electrons are rising and falling in a sequence down the length of the wire. And this is what propels surfers forward towards the beach. The water is not necessarily moving per se, it's the wave that moves and carries the surfer forward when the surfer rides the wave. But the wave is going up and down and the surfer is moving forward at right angles to the up and down movement of the wave. Now, since all of the valence electrons in a copper wire are interconnected because they're sharing. When you melt copper to create a wire, the valence electrons bond, and that creates a metallic bond of solid metal, which can be broken if you raise the electrical energy high enough, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But in a normal state at room temperature, the copper atoms are all bound together because they share the valence electron energy states, and that's a bond. All right, so they're all interconnected, and along the entire strand of the conductive medium, and all of that interconnected electrical energy is shared among all of those atoms as a collective storehouse of potential energy. So this is where the energy comes from. When we say, well, where did the energy come from in an over-unity circuit? It came from the valence electrons linked together along the entire length of that copper wire, as just one example of one component within a circuit. It doesn't come from the battery outside, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. All of the input energy is wasted. All right? All the voltage we throw at the circuit is wasted on performing a non-energetic task. Okay, so the voltage doesn't transfer. Instead, it commands the rise and fall of energetic states of the valence electrons throughout the entire length of a conductive medium. Conversely, all of the energy required to power our devices is coming from the materials of construction within the devices themselves. So, but we don't think that, because we think, because we have supplied all this voltage on the outside and we're not looking at things atomically, microscopically. We think, oh, wow, cause and effect, see? But that's fuzzy logic. It's not see. We're making a wrong conclusion based on our fuzzy perspective because we're taking a very distant perspective. Thus, the practical limit of free energy is the tolerance to which the materials of construction within a circuit limit how much energetic excitation can occur within those materials before those materials are destroyed. In other words, the bonds, the atomic bonds between them that are bonding the copper atoms together in the length of copper wire, that bond can be exceeded if the energy state becomes too excited in the neighboring atoms of copper in a copper wire. And this is what Tesla did. He knew in theory you could have any amount of energy you want to, but in practice, you got to build your circuit to accommodate the level of energy that you are planning to excite within the circuit. Otherwise, you blow up the circuit. He literally created micro fine copper dust by blowing up wire, as an example. So you don't have to just melt the insulation. You can blow up the wire itself if the wire's not built to tolerate the amount of excitation you're imposing. And either way you impose it, whether you impose it from voltage and frequency coming from outside or from within the circuit, it doesn't matter. It's the excitation of the copper atom that will determine whether or not it stays together as, bonded with other copper atoms as copper wire, or becomes destroyed, becomes broken apart. It all matters about how much energy we send through it and what is it designed to handle. Is the wire big enough? Is it, this, that, and the other thing? Anyway, if not for this practical limit imposed by the materials of construction within a circuit, free energy would be limitlessly infinite, as all of my simulations exhibit, because a simulator doesn't have physical tolerance to wire and whatnot. So you can have infinite energy in a simulator, but in the real world, there are limitations. Now, Joseph Newman had at least this much right, that the size of a coil matters more than the energy which is supplied to the coil. For if the windings of the coil is increased, namely requiring more length of wire, and so you've got to have longer wire, more copper, then its inductance is increased along with its voltage, resulting from just increasing the size of the coil, not changing the energy that you're supplying to it. And that excessive voltage can be put to good use. And, he really does a good job of illustrating that, and I think that's why he met with so much competitive failure, because basically he was giving away the goose that lays the golden egg. Now, here's a response from a critic. Thank you for your response, Vinyasi. What you say is that you have an over-unity device. Can you show it? My answer is not exactly in the positive. President Eisenhower was pressured by Exxon Oil to suppress and terminate the successful development of an over-unity device in Canada that was producing around 5 to 15 times more output than its input. This is probably why President Eisenhower warned us in his farewell address to the nation on his last day of office to beware of the military-industrial complex, because he got to meet them face-to-face and see how ugly competition can be when you're president. And yet, he wasn't really president, was he? He was just a stuffed shirt who is not commander-in-chief of the mightiest nation on earth. Quite a disappointment. And he had to take dictation and commands from a global corporation and bend his knee and pay homage to them by doing what they told him to do. He talked to the Premier of Canada and told him, "Hey, you got to put a stop to this business they're doing over here. They're creating free energy. That's no," or whatever he told them. Whatever lies he told them. He took it on faith that he knew what he was saying, and he put a stop to it, and that was the end of that development of that device. And the two links from energyfromthevacuum.com I'll put in the description to this posting. Now, this story doesn't stop there. The conspiracy theory stories, it doesn't stop there. John Jacob Astor III, he was one of the wealthiest men on the planet at the time. And this was a century ago, about 110 years ago, was murdered, but in such a way as to hide the murder in the midst of a tragedy, namely, the sinking of the Titanic. He was scheduled to publicly announce his financial support of Nikola Tesla. Oops, gone with the wind. And how about President Garfield? He was making whistle-stop railroad tours across the New England states, and he was going to stop in Buffalo, New York to announce his support of Nikola Tesla. Now, if you recall, Buffalo, New York is where Nikola Tesla demonstrated his 1931 Pierce Arrow to an assistant who claims he was his cousin, but of course everybody knows he wasn't. And so it has some precedence why Garfield would stop in Buffalo to give this announce of support. Did he make it to his destination? No. President Garfield was assassinated during the prior week before he could give his speech, because he every week he'd stop in a different town and give a speech. So what do you think my chances are of sharing anything with anyone? Certainly not for lack of desire. Stanley Meyer was murdered. Although it's much easier to sweep aside such people, publicly branding them as hooligans and charlatans so as to not believe in them, rather than go to the trouble of killing them off, but once in a while they die of mysterious causes. So I figure it's safe just to talk about it. Probably isn't. And to try to teach people electrodynamics from my perspective, how a simulator has taught me a much different viewpoint of that is in violation of conventional thermodynamics. So, well, thermodynamics only applies to real power anyway. It doesn't apply to real reactive power. And all of the electrical engineers are programmed and brainwashed to believe that reactive power is useless because it's lossless. Well, lossless means it does not come under the umbrella of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy because it's not energy. Yet it is energy of a sort. It's imaginary energy predicated on imaginary numbers such as the square root of -1. And it can be converted, as I've already noted prior. Now, I didn't explain the reason for those three techniques, but I just laid them out for you. Anyway, I'm reading to you my signature file in my emails, and I thought this would serve as a nice token gesture to share with you the way I look at things. Let's see. Going further. So rather than let you go hungry, I will repeat what I have mentioned to somebody else on YouTube. Get a hold of a Kromrey converter. Kromrey, that's Kromrey, and magnetically couple a humongous amount of ferromagnetizable iron to the ferromagnetizable iron already contained inside the two horseshoe cores of that device and see what happens. Because the Kromrey converter, in my belief, is the reincarnation of Tesla's special generator mentioned by Thomas Comerford Martin in the last chapter, chapter 43 of his book on the inventions and writings of Nikola Tesla, and it is also mentioned by William Line in his book, chapter 8, entitled Pentagon Aliens, formerly known as Space Aliens from the Pentagon, which you can buy on Amazon. Thomas's book you can download from archive.org, and you can also buy it on Amazon. But you want to start off by studying the perpetual motion holder, which was popularized, not invented, by Edward Leedskalnin, who also built Coral Castle outside of Miami, Florida. The two devices are very similar because magnetic flux does not figure into them so much as magnetic remnants, which was utilized in computer core memory between the years of 1955 and 1975. Here's another criticism from somebody else. Reactive power, is not power that can do any work. My answer is correct. That is why I advocate the conversion of reactive power into real power by way of any one of three distinct methods. There may be more, such as resistance, or a full bridge rectification from AC to DC, or a cross-wound bifilar coil in which the magnetic field of one coil will match up with the electric field of the other coil, and vice versa, if we manage to separate the phase of voltage from the phase of current by a full half cycle of angular displacement, namely 180 degrees of separation. So, individually, if you passed the kind of reactive power that my circuits create through a coil, you're going to get 0 watts. But if you have two coils and they're counter-wound, so one is wound clockwise and the other is wound counterclockwise, adjacent to each other, their fields will be shared. The magnetic field and the dielectric field of each coil will be shared with the magnetic field and the dielectric field of the other coil. Now the dielectric field is what we measure as voltage. And since the magnetic field and the dielectric field within each coil is separated by a whole half cycle in each of those two coils, and because they're counter-wound, the magnetic field of one coil will match up with the dielectric field of the other coil. Actually, we usually call it electric field, but it's kind of confusing when we're talking about electricity to talk about electric fields. So Eric Dollard, and I like it, prefers to call it the dielectric field. So the magnetic field of one coil will match up with the dielectric field of the other coil because they will both be in step. They will have 0 degrees of separation between them, and that combination will create a power factor of a power factor of +1. 0 degrees of separation between them, but a power factor of +1 and real power. And so the magnetic field of the other coil will match up with the dielectric field of the first coil and also create electricity. It's kind of like the idea of teamwork, inasmuch as free energy as a singularity does not exist. But it does exist as a quarterback end run, so to speak, which can result from the freely available reactive power of capacitive reactance and inductive reactance occurring simultaneously to create a condition of the non-saturation of current. And that's because capacitive reactance is leading current and inductive reactance is lagging current. Now, if the capacitive reactance is taken to the full value of zero power factor, which is 90 degrees displacement, in which the current leads the voltage by 90 degrees, and if you also have the same condition but in reverse direction of phase difference in time, the distance in time, with inductive reactance in which current is lagging by 90 degrees, now if you put the two together simultaneously, you get a combined separation between them of their respective currents, the inductive current and the capacitive current being separated from each other by a whole half cycle of 180 degrees. And this condition eliminates back EMF and disallows sine waves in an oscillating circuit, replacing them with triangular waves. And if you go on Amazon, you can buy my book called Oops, or you can, the third link I'm going to put in the description of this posting is to that file. You can download it for free from my website. And on page 16 and 18, I show screenshots of triangular waves, and I show that some of them are in step, and some of them are out of step by 180 degrees. Let's see. Now, since these two reactances can do no work because they are lossless, thermodynamics does not apply to them. Consequently, reactive power can only do one thing, and that is accumulate until there is so much there that when converted into real power, we have ourselves some free energy because of the impedance of the circuit gave it to us if we don't suppress it by feeding it too much voltage or too much current from a prime mover. Now, a prime mover, by definition, is an outside source of energy. Let's see. And for that, all you have to do is look at the schematic screenshots and the output shots in my Oops book, PDF file book, from page 11 onward. Let's see. Oh, I see. The schematic screenshots from page 11 onward, or the output screenshots beginning on page 19 onward. It's good to look at things from both angles. In other words, what we call impedance, and we say it's located inside of the circuit, we say that it is impeding against the input of voltage or the input of current. But the opposite perspective is also true, namely that the input voltage or the input current is acting as impedance against the production of reactive power coming from within the circuit. Pretty cool, huh? Different way of looking at things. More criticisms from somebody else. The term reactive power is a contradiction in terms, as power is a measure of the rate at which energy is converted to some other form, such as electrical energy to heat or kinetic energy. This is referred to as true power and is measured in watts. Fair enough. Reactive volt amperes, or VARs, dissipates no power. In a purely inductive circuit, the current drawn is lagging its supply voltage by 90 degrees, i.e. the phase angle is 90 degrees. Its power factor is the cosine of 90 degrees, which is i.e. 0. Now, true power is volts times current times cosine phase angle. Zero power meaning that purely reactive VA cannot dissipate power and in addition can only load up an electrical system with wattless current. Please forget this BS about free energy from reactive volt amps. If it was possible, it would have been 150 years ago. Sorry to rain on your parade, as you say in the United States. My response. Are you referring to zero power factor? Because that makes sense. Well, he was. What about negative unity power factor? That's the definition of a generator according to the passive sign convention. But it does not have to exclusively occur within a generator, because any time capacitive reactance and inductive reactance combine simultaneously results in a 180-degree displacement between them, which manifests negative unity power factor and the generation of power. So I've repeated myself a few times, I guess for emphasis. But this idea is a new one, that the voltage input or the current input it's new for me anyway. I recently realized this, that it's acting as impedance to the creation of reactive power coming from within the circuit. And that's why I have to reduce the input voltage or the input current to a considerable degree of shrinkage in order to foster and nurture and nourish the production of reactive power within the circuit. Now, sometimes, what the utility grid gives us, what the electrical engineers who designed it and manage it, what they give us is simply a gamble that most of the time everything will work, because it doesn't sometimes. But they do this by forcing a huge amount of voltage as an outside prime mover, as an outside source of energy to the grid. And this reduces the likelihood, but does not prevent entirely the possibility of a reactive outburst coming from the grid itself. And that happens sometimes. And that outburst can go either way. It can go brown out, black out, or it can go over voltage or over current and blow up pole transformers. There's videos all over YouTube about pole transformers blowing up. Check it out. That's a local explosion of reactive power. Too much reactive power is focused on that pole transformer for that to happen. And then there's other videos on YouTube about switches, mechanical switches that are relays. They're designed to open in case of an overvoltage so that the equipment does not become damaged. And when they open, they create huge arcs. Oh, it's unbelievable, some of the videos on YouTube. People have really managed to amass a lot of videos of the destructive power of electricity. Once in a while, it wants to... Let me back up. There's a phrase that Jeff Goldblum, the actor, made famous, in my view, in the movie that he was starred in... what's it called? That dinosaur movie, the first one, they come back to life. What's it called? Something Park. Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park Part 1. He says a famous line. He says, life has to get out. It cannot be bound. Sooner or later, it will find a way to break its shackles and liberate itself from bondage. Whatever bondage you put on life, it'll eventually get broken. And it's the truth. Because electricity is like a wild stallion. It wants to do whatever it wants to do, when it wants to do it, without warning you in advance. Because the essential nature of electricity is composed of two forces of nature that are in complete denial of each other, and that's why they are in complete dependence upon each other to manifest matter and energy. One is the magnetomotive force and the other is the electromotive force. And they are basically like the Yang-yin symbol in the Tao that represents the Tao. The white and the black chase each other's tails because they can't live without each other, yet they are in complete denial. What that means is there is absolutely no yin inside of yang, and there is absolutely no yang inside of yin. Each is the complete opposite of the other, the complete denial of the other. And that makes them totally dependent upon each other because they can't manifest creation on their own. They have to interact to do this. And we invite them into our circuit. And we call it, the result of that union we call the magnetic field and the electric field, which I prefer to call the dielectric field, along with Eric Dollard likes to call it that. So those two fields mingle inside our circuit. And when they have a phase difference between them of 0 degrees in time of angular displacement between them, because the electricity, as it travels down the wire, actually does a helical path, so it's an angular separation per cycle. So a cycle is 360 degrees, so if there's no separation, they're both on the mark. They both beat to the same drummer, and we get full power out of that energetic state of that piece of wire or whatever component we're talking about. But they are actually two separate forces. And they do exist as independent forces. It's simply their commingling that creates the phenomenon of electricity. Yeah. Otherwise, they'd be two separate forces, and we have no way of knowing how much force is there in each within creation. There's no way to measure it. There's no way to infer it. We could not create a capacitor big enough. No, let's put it this way. We could not create a plate, a pair of plates big enough on either side of creation to measure the total potential of reactive power that's inside of creation. We can't do it. And there's no way to infer it because the matter in creation is not enough. Matter acts as capacitor plates so that we have a point in space with which we can measure the voltage between that point and another point, and then claim there's a certain potential of energy stored in the dielectric medium of empty space between those 2 points. But we can't measure the entire creation. We create a little capacitor, or formerly known as a condenser, because it was constructed differently in the old days, but nowadays they're 2 flat plates. We put a little capacitor in our circuit and we can measure the voltage across those 2 plates. And that tells us how much voltage is stored in the dielectric medium, namely the insulator, that's in between those 2 plates. But we can't do that with creation. There's no way. There's no way to know how much potential energy is stored in creation among those 2 forces, the magnetomotive force and the electromotive force. The magnetomotive force we measure as current, and magnetism it manifests as, while the electromotive force we measure as voltage, as or what we call the electrostatic force. Or you can call it the dielectric force, as Eric Dollard prefers to call it. Be that as it may, space is a perfect medium to store dielectric charge, also known as electrostatic charge, because Nikola Tesla actually invented the first vacuum tube variable capacitors, and they did not become commercially available until a year before he died. They became available in 1942. This is why I think he went to Buffalo, New York to give the demonstration of his Pierce Arrow, 1931 Pierce Arrow, because Peter Savo says he stopped at a electronics store to pick up some radio tubes, he calls them, because Peter Savo is not an electrical engineer, and Tesla didn't tell him what type of tubes they were. So Peter Savo just thought, oh, they're radio tubes. Wrong answer. I suspect they were capacitors. And he also picked up some wire. Now, that doesn't mean all the tubes were capacitors. They might have been, vacuum tubes. You can make a diode out of a vacuum tube, too. And you can put 2 diodes together with their heads pointing together or their heads pointing away from each other to create an NPN or a PNP transistor. I may have said it in the wrong sequence because I didn't commit to memory which is which. When the cathode of each diode is pointing at each other, is that an NPN or a PNP? I don't know. It's one or the other, but it can't be both. And then the PNP is the other one when they face away from each other. The cathodes face away from each other. Anywho, I've said a lot, and I guess I can't say enough, because we all need this education as consumers. If we don't own the knowledge and understanding and appreciation of free energy, we cannot demand it. And I know this from personal experience, because back in the 1980, 81, for 1.5 years, over a period of 2 summers and 1 winter, that's not it, a little more than a year, I promoted sunflower sprouts in Los Angeles. And I did so because our consciousness of food options was very limited back in the 70s. It's not like it was today. That was the trend, the tipping zone, the tipping point. Because I read an article in Roddale Press Organic Gardening and Farming magazine, because I was a subscriber. I read an article while I was in college that these farmers were producing these baby carrots as a specialty vegetable, and they could not sell their product because the consumer was not aware of the product. And they were complaining, hey, we're stuck with these baby carrots. What do we do with them now that we got them? Now that we've developed this new food product, how do we get it to the masses? Well, they have to know that it exists. So I took a trip with some friends from school to Hawaii, and we stopped at Hilo, Hawaii, a health food store, to pick up some groceries because we were hiking through the hills. And so every week at the end of a hike, we'd pick up supplies. So we were in this health food store, and I saw these sunflower greens being grown on a flat of soil, and you'd cut how many you wanted, weigh them, and you'd take it up to the counter, and they'd charge you by weight. So you had to cut your own. Well, I thought to myself, when I left college for low grades, I got kicked out for one semester. I never went back. I went home and I built me a greenhouse, which I never finished, but I built it enough to hand water sunflower sprouts. And then I went around LA and I gave them on consignment. That means you don't charge the customer, the wholesaler or the retailer, or the person door to door. I tried every avenue imaginable. You don't charge them. You just leave it there, and if they like it and they want to pay you, fine. And, order it on a regular basis, fine. You got yourself a customer. But at your own expense, you leave it with them as a sample. And so I wouldn't leave it, continually. I didn't want to harass people with a bunch of and waste my time. I went to each type of customer only once, whether it was my neighbors or wholesalers or retailers, whoever it was. I even went to Hanson Juice Company and offered my product, but they said, well, can you produce X amount, because our juicer only juices a certain minimum per batch. And I go, oh no, that's way beyond my means. So I never got a chance to give them my product, but I had tested it. I had made sunflower greens juice and mixed it with carrot juice, and it tasted like chocolate. It was so fantastic. So I thought it was a great potential market, but whatever. I haven't seen this mixture in the stores either, so if one of you wants to make a buck, now's your chance to do it, because now we have all this. Well, what happened was, there came a point in time where people stopped ignoring my product, because there was this one store I was going to at the time, at the termination of my career, of this project of mine, in which I only made $60 and I spent $500 or more. What was the name of the store? Vicente Foods. It's on Vicente Boulevard, I think it's called, San Vicente Boulevard. It's just northwest of Wilshire Boulevard, where San Vicente crosses into Wilshire Boulevard. And it's also northwest of the VA administration complex. It's there on the west side of the 405 freeway. So Vicente Foods Market is on San Vicente Boulevard. And it's a single outlet store. It's not a chain. So it made it real easy for me. So I went in there and I left stuff on consignment once a week. And every time I'd go there, the shelf would be full of the wilted sprouts that I left from the prior week. And I would see customers walk right by it as if it was invisible. Well, one day I came for delivery, and that was not the case. The shelf was empty, and there was a customer walking by it screaming to the produce guy, "Where's my sprouts?" She owned it. It was up there. And the guy was telling me, hey, it's really popular. It took off. And they don't care about the hulls. I didn't even bother to separate the hulls. What I did was I took alfalfa cubes, and you find alfalfa sprouts, well, at least it used to be. I don't know if they still do it. Grown in cubes, plastic cube-shaped containers. They grow it right in there and then put the top on, and it makes it really easy. So that's the way I was doing it. And so the hulls were mixed in there, because I never bothered to separate the hulls. Now, a lot of the hulls would fall off and fall to the ground, but a lot of them fell inside the cube. And they were, washing it in the sink, with water and shaking it to get most of the hulls out. They were putting up with that. And yet they were demanding it, simply because they woke up. They owned it. And this is also why Shakespeare plays have lasted so long, because Shakespeare didn't write them. He just put them on. He was the front man for Christopher Marlowe, who was the true author of those plays, conveying his secret messages to the Queen of England, acting as her private spy, answerable only to her, because he had to fake his own death in order to survive, this bishop who hated his guts, and leave England and never return except under disguise, and only a few times to report directly to the Queen and to no one else, because his life was in danger at that point. So he was always assuming a nom de plume, a fake identity, as he went about Europe, acting as a spy to the Queen. Well, he put coded messages in all those plays, and the Queen knew how to decode them just while she was watching them. She knew, and she got the message right away. You know, there's English, they love stuff like palindromes and anagrams. They're really big on that stuff. It's part of their culture. And it was no different 400 years ago when the plays were written. And this all comes out in a book by Roberta Ballantyne, who wrote a book called Marlowe. You can get it on Amazon. It's huge. It's unbelievable what it talks about in there. Anyway, because he didn't write the plays, he couldn't take credit for them. We had to take credit. I know it doesn't sound like it makes sense because we like to think that Shakespeare wrote them, but he didn't. And I did this game when I went to this college in Iowa when I was in the 70s, when I was a teenager. I played this game because I knew in my heart that all people have access to clairvoyance and clairaudience and intuition, except it's a subconscious thing that we're not aware of. But that doesn't mean our subconscious mind does not have access. Just because we don't have conscious access to it doesn't mean our subconscious does not have access to it. And so I did a little game in which I would sought to determine whether or not people could access that understanding if pressed to do so. And I found in every case they were accessing it, whether or not they gave credit to it, whether or not they were aware that they were giving credit to it. I would create these scenarios to test people. And so I did my little statistical survey of the population at that meditating college, and I found that everyone has access to intuition if the need arises. Their subconscious will automatically have access to it. It's just a question of whether or not they give conscious recognition where recognition is due. That's a variation of the person's conscious awareness. Well, this is why we own the Shakespeare plays, because we know deep inside our awareness, or in our subconscious awareness, that they were not written by Shakespeare, and that the person who wrote them never took the credit. And so in order for someone to take the credit, then we do. And whoever takes the credit takes the responsibility, the onus of responsibility, the burden of responsibility for maintaining an interest in promoting the Shakespeare plays or whatever it is that has been created. Now, if the inventor or the creator, the author, takes the credit, then it's up to him to keep up promoting it. And if he doesn't, it falls by the wayside and gets replaced by something else. You know how it works. Andy Warhol said, we'll all get our 15 seconds of fame. That's because he assumed that the person would always take the credit for what he created, or she. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're forced to, like Christopher Marlowe, not to take credit. And then the audience, the receiver, has to take the credit. And if we like it, then the audience outlives the author. And so the Shakespeare plays will probably be popular for another 4 centuries, just like they were already. They are going to last a long time because we own them. Not just because they're so good, but because we act like we created them. We own them. We think they're so good because we own them. That's why we think they're so good. And so this is the way the consumer has to look at free energy. They have to own it before it can be demanded of commerce. Because commerce is not going to provide it, because it's not good for commerce. It's not good for the bankers. It's not good for the military edge, to have a military edge. It's good for sharing. It's good for making sure that everybody has an equal share of power so that they have all the necessities of life and don't have to struggle for a living. But that's not the way our culture works. Our culture works on the basis of privilege. And it's more than privilege. I'm learning the hard way. See, I never had to work much in my life except for the experience. Now I'm forced to. When I should be retired. I'm retirement age, but here I am working. And it's a blue-collar job. It's a tough job. I don't like it. It's physically demanding, and I don't handle it very well. Be that as it may, I'm learning that there are nasty people out there who love to see other people suffer. They get joy out of watching somebody else suffer. And although some people will call that evil, I prefer to call it a perversion of the truth of life. Because the truth of life is not that way. You have to develop into that by hook or by crook, some way or another, because it's not natural to want to see somebody else suffer and get joy out of it. So it's a perversion of our natural state as a human being. Be that as it may, it is a fact of life that there are enough of those people around. You bump into them once in a while and you get a shock that, I don't know, it shocks me because I don't expect it. I don't see it coming. I never do. I'm such a sucker. I'm like W.C. Fields. There's a sucker born every minute. Yeah, I'm one of them. Because I want to trust everyone. I want to believe everybody's fair with each other and wants to share. And boy, am I wrong. Now, most of humanity is not that way. Most of humanity are lambs led to the slaughter by the ones who like to see other people suffer. And also most of humanity wants to belong to the group of lambs who are being led to the slaughter. And only a small portion actually are perverted with power and influence that they enjoy exercising that power in such a way as to cause suffering for somebody else. I don't understand it. It is what it is, but that's the way it is. So I think I've talked enough. I have a low battery warning here, and I think I'm going to shut up now.